Hello, and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live. Produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company, I am your host, Bo Heckman. Today we'll be continuing the epic adventure of Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. I'm really enjoying reading this one. This one's just so descriptive and so much fun. Yesterday we actually saw him. We left off with him creating his first toy, which was kind of a thrilling moment. That was really neat to see happening in the story there. He has now come to a place called Laughing Valley. I'm trying to recap what happened yesterday, and it's just a fascinating story about this baby who was left on the edge of the woods. He was raised by fantasy creatures, as we would call them. He grew up not knowing about humanity, and he thought he was quite alone in growing up. And then, reaching a certain age, he was taken by the ruler of them all to show him the world, and that he was very much not alone. That there were other humans out there. He is just a very fascinating story. He's now moved away to a different place. He's created his first toy. So we're going to pick up there today. Hope everyone's having a great Monday morning so far. And we will just jump right into the tale with the third chapter under the title Manhood, in How the Rills Colored the Toys. So just sit back, relax, or swing from the chandelier if that's your thing, and enjoy the life and adventures of Santa Claus. Chapter 3rd, How the Rills Colored the Toys. A hush lay on the Laughing Valley now. Snow covered it like white spread, and pillows of downy flakes drifted before the dwelling where Claus sat feeding the blaze of the fire. The brook gurgled on beneath a heavy sheet of ice, and all living plants and insects nestled close to Mother Earth to keep warm. The face of the moon was hid by dark clouds, and the wind, delighting in the wintry sport, pushed and whirled the snowflakes in so many directions that they could get no chance to fall to the ground. Claus heard the wind whistling and shrieking in its play, and thanked the good Nooks again for his comfortable shelter. Blinky washed her face lazily and stared at the coals with a look of perfect content. The toy cat sat opposite the real one and gazed straight ahead, as toy cats should. Suddenly, Claus heard a noise that sounded different from the voice of the wind. It was more like a wail of suffering and despair. He stood up and listened, but the wind, growing boisterous, shook the door and rattled the windows to distract his attention. He waited until the wind was tired, and then, still listening, he heard once more the shrill cry of distress. Quickly, he drew on his coat, pulled his cap over his eyes, and opened the door. The wind dashed in and scattered the embers over the hearth, at the same time blowing Blinky's fur so furiously that she crept under the table to escape. Then the door was closed, and Claus was outside, peering anxiously into the darkness. The wind laughed and scolded and tried to push him over, but he stood firm. The helpless flakes stumbled against his eyes and dimmed his sight, but he rubbed them away and looked again. Snow was everywhere, white and glittering. It covered the earth and filled the air. The cry was not repeated. Claus turned to go back into the house, but the wind caught him unawares, and he stumbled and fell across a snowdrift. His hand plunged into the drift and touched something that was not snow. This he seized, and pulling it gently toward him, found it to be a child. The next moment he had lifted it in his arms and carried it into the house. The wind followed him through the door, but Claus shut it out quickly. He laid the rescued child on the hearth and brushed away the snow, he discovered it to be Weekum, a little boy who lived in a house beyond the valley. Claus wrapped a warm blanket around the little one and rubbed the frost from his limbs. Before long, the child opened his eyes, and seeing where he was, smiled happily. Then Claus warmed milk and fed it to the boy slowly, while the cat looked on with sober curiosity. Finally, the little one curled up in his friend's arms and sighed and fell asleep, and Claus, filled with gladness that he had found the wanderer, held him closely while he slumbered. The wind, finding no more mischief to do, climbed the hill and swept on toward the north. This gave the weary snowflakes time to settle down to earth, and the valley became still again. The boy, having slept well in the arms of his friend, opened his eyes and sat up. Then, as a child will, he looked around the room and saw all that it contained. "Your cat is a nice cat, Claus," he said at last. "Let me hold it." But Puss objected and ran away. "The other cat won't run, Claus," continued the boy. "Let me hold that one." Claus placed the toy in his arms, and the boy held it lovingly and kissed the tip of its wooden ear. "How did you get lost in the storm, Weekum?" asked Claus. "I started to walk to my auntie's house and lost my way," answered Weekum. "Were you frightened?" "It was cold," said Weekum, "and the snow got in my eyes so that I could not see. Then I kept on till I fell in the snow without knowing where I was, and the wind blew the flakes over me and covered me up." Claus gently stroked his head, and the boy looked up at him and smiled. "I'm all right now," said Weekum. "Yes," replied Claus happily. "Now I will put you in my warm bed, and you must sleep until morning, when I will carry you back to your mother." "May the cat sleep with me?" asked the boy. "Yes, if you wish it to," answered Claus. "It's a nice cat," Weekum said, smiling, as Claus tucked the blankets around him, and presently the little one fell asleep with the wooden toy in his arms. When morning came, the sun claimed the Laughing Valley and flooded it with his rays, so Claus prepared to take the lost child back to its mother. May I keep the cat, Claus?" asked Weekum. "It's nicer than real cats. It doesn't run away, or scratch, or bite. May I keep it?" "Yes, indeed," answered Claus, pleased that the toy he had made could give pleasure to the child. So he wrapped the boy and the wooden cat in a warm cloak, perching the bundle upon his own broad shoulders, and then he trampled through the snow and the drifts of the valley and across the plain beyond the poor cottage where Weekum's mother lived. "See, Mama," cried the boy, and soon as they entered, "I've got a cat." The good woman wept tears of joy over the rescue of her darling and thanked Claus many times for his kind act. So he carried a warm and happy heart back to his home in the valley. That night he said to the puss, "I believe the children will love the wooden cats almost as well as the real ones, and they can't hurt them by pulling their tails and ears. I'll make another." So this was the beginning of his great work. The next cat was better made than the first. While Claus sat whittling it out of the yellow rill, came back to make him a visit, and so pleased was he with the man's skill that he ran away and brought several of his fellows. There sat the red rill, the black rill, the green rill, the blue rill, and the yellow rill in a circle on the floor, while Claus whittled and whistled, and the wooden cat grew into a shape. "If it could be made the same color as the real cat, no one would know the difference," said Yellow Rill thoughtfully. "The little ones, maybe, would not know the difference," replied Claus, pleased with the idea. "It will bring you some of the red that I color my roses and tulips with," cried Red Rill. "And then you can make that cat's lips and tongue red." "I will bring some of the green that I color my grasses and leaves with," said the Green Rill. "And then you can color the cat's eyes green." "They will need a bit of yellow also," remarked the Yellow Rill. "I must fetch some of the yellow that I use to color my buttercups and goldenrods with." "The real cat is black," said the Black Rill. "If I will bring some of the black that I use to color the eyes of my pansies with, and then you can paint your wooden cat black." "I see you have a blue ribbon around the Blinky's neck," added the Blue Rill. "I will get some of the color that I use to paint the bluebells and the forget-me-nots with, and then you can carve a wooden ribbon on the toy cat's neck and paint it blue." So the rills disappeared, and by the time Claus had finished carving out the form of the cat, they were all back with paints and brushes. They made Blinky sit upon the table, that Claus might paint the toy cat just the right color. And when the work was done, the rills declared it was exactly as good as a live cat. "That is, to all appearances," added the Red Rill. Blinky seemed a little offended by the attention bestowed upon the toy, and that she might not seem to approve the imitation cat, she walked to the corner of the hearth and sat down with a dignified air. But Claus was delighted, and as soon as morning came, he started out and trampled through the snow, across the valley and the plain, until he came to a village. There, in a poor hut near the walls of the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd, a little girl lay upon a wretched cot, moaning in pain. Claus approached the child and kissed her and comforted her, and then he drew the toy cat from beneath his coat, where he had hidden it, and placed it in her arms. Ah, how well he felt himself rapid for his labor and his long walk, that he saw the little one's eyes grow bright with pleasure. She hugged the kitty tight to her breast, as if it had been a precious gem, and would not let it go for a single moment. The fever was quieted, the pain grew less, and she fell into a sweet and refreshing sleep. Claus laughed and whistled and sang all the way home. Never had he been so happy as on that day. When he entered his house, he found Shiegra, the lioness, waiting him. Since his babyhood, Shiegra had loved Claus, and while he dwelt in the forest, she had often come to visit him at Nicile's bower. After Claus had gone to live in the Laughing Valley, Shiegra became lonely and ill at ease, and now she had braved the snow drifts, which all lions abhor, to see him once again. Shiegra was getting old, and her teeth were beginning to fall out, while the hairs that tipped her ears and tail had changed from tawny yellow to white. Claus found her lying on his hearth. He put his arms around the neck of the lioness and hugged her lovingly. The cat had retired into a far corner. She did not care to associate with Shiegra. Claus told his old friend about the cats he had made, and how much pleasure they had given Rikum and the sick girl. Shiegra did not know much about children. Indeed, if she met a child, she could scarcely be trusted not to devour it. But she was interested in Claus's new neighbors and said, "These images seem to me very attractive, yet I cannot see why you should make cats, which are very unimportant animals. Suppose, now that I am here, you make the image of a lioness, the queen of all beasts. Then, indeed, your children will be happy and safe at the same time." Claus thought this was a good suggestion, so he got a piece of wood and sharpened his knife, while Shiegra crouched upon the hearth at his feet. With much care, he carved the head in the likeness of the lioness, even to the two fierce teeth that curved over her lower lip and the deep frowning lines above her wide-open eyes. When it was finished, he said, "You have a terrible look, Shiegra." "Then the image is like me," she answered, for I am indeed terrible to all who are not my friends. Claus now carved out the body, with Shiegra's long tail trailing behind it. The image of the crouching lioness was very lifelike. "It pleases me," said Shiegra, yawning and stretching her body gracefully. "I will watch while you paint." He brought the paints the Ryls had given him from the cupboard and colored the image to resemble the real Shiegra. The lioness placed her big, padded paws upon the edge of the table and raised herself while she carefully examined the toy that was her likeness. "You are indeed skillful," she said proudly. "The children will like that better than cats, I'm sure." Then, snarling at Blinky, who arched her back in terror and whined fearfully, she walked away toward her forest home with stately strides. Chapter 4th. How Little Mary Became Frightened. The winter was over now, and all the Laughing Valley was filled with joyous excitement. The brook was also happy at being free once again, that it gurgled more boisterously than ever, and dashed so recklessly against the rocks that it sent showers of spray high in the air. The grass thrust its sharp little blades upward through the meat of dead stalks where it had hidden from the snow, but the flowers were yet too timid to show themselves, although the rills were busy feeding their roots. The sun was in remarkably good humor, and sent its rays dancing merrily throughout the valley. Claus was eating his dinner one day when he heard a timid knock on his door. "Come in," he called. No one entered, but after a pause came another rapping. Claus jumped up and threw open the door. Before him stood a small girl, holding a smaller brother fast by the hand. "Is you to Claus?" she asked shyly. "Indeed I am, my dear," he answered with a laugh, as he caught both children in his arms and kissed them. "You are very welcome, and you have come just in time to share my dinner." He took them to the table and fed them with fresh milk and nut cakes. When they had eaten enough, he asked, "Why have you made this long journey to see me?" "I wants a tat," replied little Mary, and her brother, who had not yet learned to speak many words, nodded his head and exclaimed like an echo, "Cat!" "Oh, you want my toy cats, do you?" turned Claus, greatly pleased to discover that his creations were so popular with children. The little visitors nodded eagerly. "Unfortunately," he continued, "I have but one cat now ready, for I carried 2 to children in the town yesterday. And the one I have shall be given to your brother, Mary, because he is the smaller, and the next one I make shall be for you." The boy's face was bright with smiles as he took the precious toy Claus held out to him, but little Mary covered her face with her arm and began to sob grievously. I want a tat now," she wailed. Her disappointment made Claus feel miserable for a moment. Then he suddenly remembered Shiegra. "Don't cry, darling," he said soothingly. "I have a toy much nicer than the cat, and you shall have that." He went to the cupboard and drew out the image of the lioness, which he placed on the table before Mary. The girl raised her arm and gave one glance at the fierce teeth and glaring eyes of the beast, and then, uttering a terrified scream, she rushed from the house. The boy followed her, also screaming lustily, and even dropping his precious cat in his fear. For a moment Claus stood, motionless, being puzzled and astonished. Then he threw Shiegra's image into the cupboard and ran after the children, calling to them not to be frightened. Little Mary stopped in her flight, and her brother clung to her skirt, but they both cast fearful glances at the house until Claus had assured them many times that the beast had been locked in the cupboard. "Yes, why are you frightened at seeing it?" he asked. It is only a toy to play with. It is bad, said Mary, decidedly, and and just horrid, and not a bit nice like cats. Perhaps you are right, returned Claus thoughtfully. But if you will return with me to the house, I will soon make you a pretty cat. So they timidly entered the house again, having faith in their friend's words, and afterward they had the joy of watching Claus carve out a cat from a bit of wood and paint it in natural colors. It did not take him long to do this, for he had become skillful with his knife by his time, and Mary loved her toy the more dearly because she had seen it made. After his little visitors had trotted away on their journey homeward, Claus sat long in deep thought, and he then decided that such fierce creatures as his friend the lioness would never do as models from which to fashion his toys. There must be nothing to frighten the dear babies, he reflected, and while I know Shiegra well, and am not afraid of her, it is but natural that the children should look upon her image with terror. Hereafter I will choose such mild-mannered animals as squirrels and rabbits and deer and lambkins from which to carve my toys, for then the little ones will love rather than fear them. He began his work that very day, and before bedtime he had made a wooden rabbit and a lamb. They were not quite so lifelike as the cats had been, because they were formed from memory, while Blinky had sat very still for Claus to look at while he worked. But the new toys seemed to please the children nevertheless, and the fame of Claus's playthings quickly spread to every cottage on plain and in village. He always carried his gifts to the sick or crippled children, but those who were strong enough walked to the house in the valley to ask for them, so a little path was soon worn from the plain to the door of the toy maker's cottage. First came the children who had been playmates of Claus, before he had began to make toys. These, you may be sure, were well supplied. Then children who lived farther away heard of the wonderful images and made journeys to the valley to secure them. All these little ones were welcome, and never a one went away empty-handed. This demand for his handiwork kept Claus busily occupied, but he was quite happy in knowing the pleasure he was to give so many of the dear children. His friends, the immortals, were pleased with his success and supported him bravely. The Knooks selected for him clear pieces of soft wood, that his knife might not be blunted in cutting them. The Rills had kept him supplied with paints of all colors and brushes fashioned from the tips of timothy grasses. The fairies discovered that the workmen needed saws and chisels and hammers and nails as well as knives, and brought him a goodly array of such tools. Claus soon turned his living room into a most wonderful workshop. He built a bench before the window and arranged his tools and paints so that he could reach everything as he sat on his stool. And as he finished toy after toy to delight the hearts of little children, he found himself growing so gay and happy that he could not refrain from singing and laughing and whistling all the day long. "It's because I live in the Laughing Valley, where everything else laughs," said Claus. But that was not the reason. Chapter 5. How Bessie Blithesome Came to the Laughing Valley. One day, as Claus sat before his door to enjoy the sunshine while he busily carved the head and horns of a toy deer, he looked up and discovered a glittering cavalcade of horsemen approaching through the valley. When they drew nearer, he saw that the band consisted of a score of men-at-arms, clad in bright armor and bearing in their hands spears and battle-axes. In front of these rode little Bessie Blithestone, the pretty daughter of that proud lord of Lurd who had once driven Claus from his palace. Her palfrey was pure white, Its bridle was covered with glittering gems, and its saddle draped with cloth of gold, richly broidered. The soldiers were sent to protect her from harm while she journeyed. Claus was surprised, but he continued to whittle and to sing until the cavalcade drew up before him. Then the little girl leaned over the neck of her palfrey and said, "Please, Mr. Claus, I want a toy." Her voice was so pleading that Claus jumped up at once and stood beside her. But he was puzzled how to answer her request. "You are a rich lord's daughter," said he, "and have all that you desire." "Except toys," added Bessie. "There are no toys in all the world but yours." "And I make them for poor children who have nothing else to amuse them," continued Claus. "Do poor children love to play with toys more than rich ones?" asked Bessie. "I suppose not," said Claus thoughtfully. "Am I to blame because my father is a lord? Must I be denied the pretty toys I long for because other children are poorer than I?" she inquired earnestly. "I am afraid you must, dear," he answered, "for the poor have nothing else with which to amuse themselves. You have your pony to ride, your servants to wait on you, and every comfort that money can produce." "But I want toys," cried Bessie, wiping away the tears that forced themselves into her eyes. "If I cannot have them, I shall be very unhappy." Claus was troubled, for her grief recalled to him the thought that his desire was to make all children happy, without regard to their condition in life. Yet, while so many poor children were clamoring for his toys, he could not bear to give one of them to Bessie Blithestone, who had so much already to make her happy. "Listen, my child," said he gently. "All the toys I am now making are promised to others, but the next shall be yours, since your heart so longs for it. Come to me again in 2 days, and it shall be ready for you." Bessie gave a cry of delight, and leaning over her pony's neck, she kissed Claus prettily upon her forehead. Then, calling to her men-at-arms, she rode gaily away, leaving Claus to resume his work. "If I am to supply the rich children as well as the poor ones," he thought, "I shall not have a spare moment in the whole year. But is it right I should give to the rich? Surely I must go to Necile and talk with her about this matter." So, when he had finished the toy deer, which was very like a deer he had known in the forest glades, he walked into Burzee and made his way to the bower of the beautiful nymph Necile, who had been his foster mother. She greeted him tenderly and lovingly, listening with interest to his story of the visit of Bessie Blithesome. "And now tell me," said he, "shall I give toys to rich children?" "We of the forest know nothing of riches," she replied. "It seems to me that one child is like another child, since they are all made of the same clay, and that riches are like a gown, which may be put on or taken away, leaving the child unchanged. But the fairies are guardians of mankind, and know mortal children better than I. Let us call the fairy queen." This was done, and the queen of the fairies sat beside them and heard Claus relate his reasons for thinking the rich children could get along without his toys, and also what the nymph had said. "Necile is right," declared the queen, "for, whether it be rich or poor, a child's longings for pretty playthings are but natural. Rich Bessie's heart may suffer as much grief as poor Mary's. She can be just as lonely and disconnected, and just as gay and happy. I think, friend Claus, it is your duty to make all little ones glad, whether they chance to live in palaces or in cottages." "Your words are wise, fair queen," replied Claus, "and my heart tells me they are just as they are wise. Hereafter, all children may claim my services." Then he bowed before the gracious fairy, and, kissing Nestle's red lips, went back into his valley. At the brook he stopped to drink, and afterward he sat on the bank and took a piece of moist clay in his hands, while he thought what sort of toy he should make for Bessie Blithesome. He did not notice that his fingers were working the clay into a shape until, glancing downward, he found he had unconsciously formed a head that bore a slight resemblance to the nymph Necile. At once he became interested. Gathering more of the clay from the bank, he carried it to his house. Then, with the aid of his knife and a bit of wood, he succeeded in working the clay into the image of a toy nymph. With skillful strokes, he formed long, waving hair on the head and covered the body with a gown of oak leaves, while the 2 feet sticking out at the bottom of the gown were clad in sandals. But the clay was soft, and Claus found he must handle it gently to avoid ruining his pretty work. Perhaps the rays of sun will draw out the moisture and cause the clay to become hard, he thought. So he laid the image on a flat board and placed it in the glare of the sun. This done, he went to his bench and began painting the toy deer, and soon he became so interested in the work that he forgot all about the clay nymph. But next morning, happening to notice it as it lay on the board, he found the sun had baked it into the hardness of stone, and it was strong enough to be safely handled. Claus now painted the nymph with great care in the likeness of Necile, giving it deep blue eyes, white teeth, rosy lips, and ruddy brown hair. The gown he colored oak leaf green, and when the paint was dry, Claus himself was so charmed with the new toy. Of course, it was not nearly so lovely as the real Necile, but considering the material of which it was made, Claus thought it was very beautiful. When Bessie, riding upon her white palfrey, came to his dwelling next day, Claus presented her with the new toy. The little girl's eyes were brighter than ever as she examined the pretty image, and she loved it at once and held it close to her breast as a mother does to her child. "What is it called, Claus?" she asked. Now Claus knew that nymphs do not like to be spoken of by mortals, so he could not tell Bessie it was an image of Necile he had given her. But as it was a new toy, he searched his mind for a new name to call it by, and the first word he thought of, he decided would do very well. "It's called a dolly, my dear," he said to Bessie. I shall call the dolly my baby," returned Bessie, kissing it fondly, "and I shall tend it and care for it just as nurse cares for me. Thank you very much, Claus. Your gift has made me happier than I have ever been before." Then she rode away, hugging the toy in her arms, and Claus, seeing her delight, thought he would make another dolly, better and more natural than the first. He brought more clay from the brook, and remembering that Bessie had called the dolly her baby, he resolved to form this one into a baby's image. That was no difficult task to the clever workman, and soon the baby dolly was lying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then, with the clay that was left, he began to make an image of Bessie Blithesome herself. This was not so easy, for he found he could not make the silken robe of the Lord's daughter out of the common clay. So he called the fairies to his aid, and asked them to bring him colored silks with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off once on their errand, and before nightfall they had returned with a generous supply of silks and laces and golden threads. Claus now became impatient to complete his new dolly, and instead of waiting for the next day's sun, he placed the clay image upon his hearth and covered it over with glowing coals. By morning, when he drew the dolly from the ashes, it had baked as hard as if it had lain a full day in the hot sun. Now our Claus became a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and nearly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fitted the new dolly, and he put a lace collar around its neck and a pink silk shoes on its feet. The natural color of baked clay is a light gray, but Claus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's brown eyes and golden hair and rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring joy to some childish heart. While Claus was admiring it, he heard a knock at his door, and little Mary entered. Her face was sad, her eyes red with continued weeping. "Why, what has grieved you, my dear?" asked Claus, taking the child in his arms. I've broke my tat," sobbed Mary. "How?" he inquired, his eyes twinkling. I dropped him and broke off him's tail, and then I dropped him and broke off him's ear, and now him's all spoilt." Claus laughed. "Never mind, Mary dear," he said. "How would you like this new dolly instead of a cat?" Mary looked at the silk-robed dolly, and her eyes grew big with astonishment. "Oh, it's Claus," she replied, clapping her small hands together with rapture. "Can I have a boo'ful lady?" "Do you like it?" she asked. "I love it," said she. "It's better than tats." "Then take it, dear, and be careful not to break it." Mary took the dolly with a joy that was almost reverent, and her face dimpled with smiles as she started along the path toward home. Chapter 6. The Wickedness of the Awgwas. I must now tell you something about the Awgwas, that terrible race of creatures which cause our good Claus so much trouble, and nearly succeeded in robbing the children of the world their earliest and best friend. I do not like to mention the Awgwas, but they are a part of this story and cannot be ignored. They were neither mortals nor immortals, but stood midway between those classes of beings. The Awgwas were made invisible to ordinary people, but not to immortals. They could pass swiftly through the air from one part of the world to another, and had the power of influencing the minds of human beings to do their wicked will. They were of gigantic stature, and had coarse, scowling countenances, which showed plainly their hatred of all mankind. They possessed no consciences whatever, and delighted only in evil deeds. Their homes were in rocky, mountainous places, from whence they sallied forth to accomplish their wicked purposes. The one of their number that could think of the most horrible deed for them to do was always elected the King Awgwa, and all the race obeyed his orders. Sometimes these creatures lived to become 100 years old, but usually they fought so fiercely amongst themselves that many were destroyed in combat, and when they died, that was the end of them. Mortals were powerless to harm them, and the immortals shuddered when the Awgwas were mentioned, and always avoided them. So they flourished for many years unopposed, and accomplished much evil. I am glad to assure you that these vile creatures have long since perished and passed from the earth. But in the days when Claus was making his first toys, they were a numerous and powerful tribe. One of the principal sports of the Awgwas was to inspire angry passions in the hearts of little children, so that they quarreled and fought with one another. They would tempt boys to eat of unripe fruit, and then delight in the pain they suffered. They urged little girls to disobey their parents, and then would laugh when the children were punished. I do not know what causes a child to be naughty in these days, but when the Awgwas were on earth, naughty children were usually under their influence. Now, when Claus began to make children unhappy, he kept them out of the power of the Awgwas. Now, when Claus began to make children happy, He kept them out of the power of the Aguas, for children possessing such lovely playthings as he gave them had no wish to obey the evil thoughts the Aguas tried to thrust into their minds. Therefore, one year when the wicked tribe was to elect it a new king, they chose an Agua who proposed to destroy Claus and take him away from the children. There are, as you know, fewer naughty children in the world since Claus came into the Laughing Valley and began to make his toys, said the new king, as he squatted upon the rock and looked around at the scowling faces of his people. Why, Bessie Blithesome has not stamped her foot once since this month, nor has Mary's brother slapped his sister's face or thrown the puppy into the rain barrel. Little Recum took his bath last night without screaming or struggling, because his mother had promised he should take his toy cat to bed with him. Such a condition of affairs is awful for any Agua to think of, and the only way we can direct the naughty actions of children is to take this person Claus away from them. Good, good, cried the big Aguas in a chorus, and they clapped their hands to applaud the speech of the king. But what shall we do with them? Asked one of the creatures. I have a plan, replied the wicked king, and what his plan was you will soon discover. That night, Claus went to bed feeling very happy, for he had completed no less than 4 pretty toys during the day, and they were sure, he thought, to make 4 little children happy. But while he slept, the band of invisible Aguas surrounded his bed, bound him with stout cords, and then flew away with him in the middle of the dark forest in far-off Aethop, where they laid him down and left him. When morning came, Claus found himself thousands of miles from any human being, a prisoner in the wild jungle of an unknown land. From the limb of a tree above his head swayed a huge python, one of those reptiles that are able to crush a man's bones in their coils. A few yards away crouched a savage panther, its glaring red eyes fixed dull on the helpless Claus. One of those monstrous spotted spiders whose sting is death crept stealthily toward him over the matted leaves, which shriveled and turned black at its very touch. But Claus had been reared in Burzee and was not afraid. Come to me, ye nooks of the forest, he cried, and gave the low particular whistle that the nooks know. The panther, which was about to spring upon its victim, turned and slunk away. The python swung itself into the tree and disappeared among the leaves. The spider stopped short in its advance and hid beneath a rotting log. Claus had no time to notice them, for he was surrounded by a band of harsh-featured nooks, more crooked and deformed in appearance than any he had ever seen. Who are you that call on us? Demanded one in a gruff voice. The friend of your brothers in Burzee, answered Claus. I have been brought here by my enemies, the Aguas, and left to perish miserably. Yet now I implore your help to release me and to send me home again. Have you the sign? Asked another. Yes, said Claus. They cut his bonds, and with his free arms he made the secret sign of the nooks. Instantly they assisted him to stand upon his feet, and they brought him food and drink to strengthen him. Our brothers of Burzee make queer friends, grumbled the ancient nook, whose flowing beard was pure white. But he who knows our secret sign and signal is entitled to our help, wherever he may be, whoever he may be. Close your eyes, stranger, and we will conduct you to your home. Where shall we seek it? 'Tis in the Laughing Valley, answered Claus, shutting his eyes. There is but one Laughing Valley in the known world, so we cannot go astray, remarked the Nook. As he spoke, the sound of his voice seemed to die away, so Claus opened his eyes to see what caused the change. To his astonishment, he found himself seated on the bench by his own door, with the Laughing Valley spread out before him. That day he visited the Wood Nymphs and related his adventure to Queen Zerline and Necile. "The Aguas have become your enemies," said the lovely queen thoughtfully. "So we must do all we can to protect you from their power." "It was cowardly to bind him up while he slept," remarked Necile with indignation. "The evil ones are ever cowardly," answered Zerline. "But your friend's slumber shall not be disturbed again." The queen herself came to the dwelling of Claus that evening and placed her seal on every door and window to keep out the Aguas. And under the seal of Queen Zerline was placed the seal of the fairies, and the seal of the rills, and the seal of the nooks, and the charm might become more powerful. And Claus carried his toys to the children again, and made many more of the little ones happy. You may guess how angry the King Agua and his fierce band were when it was known to them that Claus had escaped from the Forest of Burzee. They raged madly for a whole week, and then held another meeting among the rocks. "It is useless to carry him where the nooks reign," said the king, "for he has their protection. So let us cast him into a cave of our own mountains, where he will surely perish." This was promptly agreed to, and the wicked band set out that night to seize Claus. But they found his dwelling guarded by the seals of the immortals, and were obliged to go away baffled and disappointed. "Never mind," said the king. "He does not sleep always." Next day, as Claus traveled to the village across the plain, where he intended to present a toy squirrel to a lame boy, he was suddenly set upon by the Aguas, who seized him and carried him away to the mountains. There they thrust him within a deep cavern, and rolled many huge rocks against the entrance to prevent his escape. Deprived thus of light and food, and with little air to breathe, our Claus was, indeed, a pitiful sight. But he spoke the mystic words of the fairies, which always commanded their friendly aid, and they came to his rescue and transported him to the Laughing Valley in the twinkling of an eye. Thus the Aguas discovered they might not destroy one who had earned the friendship of the immortals. So the evil band sought other means of keeping Claus from bringing happiness to children, and so making them obedient. Whenever Claus set out to carry his toys to the little ones, an Agua, who had been set to watch his movements, sprang upon him and snatched the toys from his grasp. And the children were no more disappointed than was Claus when he was obliged to return home disconsolate. Still he persevered, and made many toys for his little friends, and started with them for the villages. And always the Aguas robbed him as soon as he had left the valley. They threw the stolen playthings into one of their lonely caverns, and quite a heap of toys accumulated before Claus became discouraged and gave up all attempts to leave the valley. Then children began coming to him, once they found he did not go to them. But the wicked Aguas flew around them and caused their steps to stray, and the paths to become crooked, so never a little one could find a way into the Laughing Valley. Lonely days now fell upon Claus, for he was denied the pleasure of bringing happiness to children whom he had learned to love. Yet he bore up bravely, for he thought surely the time would come when the Aguas would abandon their evil designs to injure them. He devoted all his hours to toy-making, and when one plaything had been completed, he stood it on a shelf he had built for that purpose. When the shelf became filled with the rows of toys, he made another one, and filled that also, so that in time he had many shelves filled with gay and beautiful toys representing horses, dogs, cats, elephants, lambs, rabbits, and deer, as well as pretty dolls of all sizes, and balls and marbles of baked clay painted in gay colors. Often, as he glanced at this array of childish treasures, the heart of good old Claus became sad, So greatly did he long to carry the toys to his children. At last, because he could not bear it no longer, he ventured to go to the great Ak, to whom he told the story of his persecution by the Aguas, and begged the Master Woodsman to assist him. Chapter 7th. The Great Battle Between Good and Evil. Ak listened gravely to the recital of Claus, stroking his beard the while with the slow, graceful motion that betokened deep thought. He noted approvingly when Claus told how the Nooks and fairies had saved him from death, and frowned when he heard how the Aguas had stolen the child's toys. At last he said, "From the beginning I have approved the work you are doing among the children of men, and it annoys me that your good deeds should be thwarted by the Aguas. We immortals have no connection whatever with the evil creatures who have attacked you. Always have we avoided them, and they, in turn, have hitherto taken care not to cross our pathway. But in this matter, I find they have interfered with one of our friends, and I will ask them to abandon their persecutions, as you are under our protection." Claus thanked the Master Woodsman most gratefully and returned to his valley, while Ak never delayed carrying out his promises, at once traveled to the mountains of the Aguas. There, standing on the bare rocks, he called on the king and spoke his people to appear. Instantly, the place was filled with throngs of the scowling Aguas, and their king, perching himself on a point of rock, demanded fiercely, "Who dares call upon us?" "It is I, the Master Woodsman of the world," responded Ak. "Here are no forests for you to claim," cried the king angrily. "We owe no allegiance to you, nor to any immortal." "That is true," replied Ak calmly. "Yet you have ventured to interfere with the actions of Claus, who dwells in the Laughing Valley and is under our protection." Many of the Aguas began muttering at this speech, and their king turned threateningly on the Master Woodsman. "You are set to rule the forests, but not the plains and not the valley, but the plains and the valleys are ours," he shouted. "Keep to your own dark woods. We will do as we please with Claus." "You shall do no harm to our friend in any way," replied Ak. "Shall we not?" asked the king impudently. "You will see. Our powers are vastly superior to those of immortals, and fully as great as those of immortals." "It is your conceit that misleads you," said Ak sternly. "You are a transient race, passing from life into nothingness. We, who live forever, pity but despise you. On earth you are scorned by all, and in heaven you have no place. Even the mortals, after their earth life, enter another existence for all time, and so are your superiors. How then dare you, who are neither mortal nor immortal, refuse to obey my wish?" The Aguas sprang to their feet with menacing gestures, but their king motioned them back. "Never before," he cried to Ak, while his voice trembled with rage, "has an immortal declared himself the master of the Aguas. Never shall an immortal venture to interfere with our actions again, for we will avenge your scornful words by killing your friend Claus within 3 days. Nor you, nor all the immortals can save him from our wrath. We defy your powers. Begone, Master Woodsman of the world. In the country of the Aguas, you have no place." "It is war," declared Ak with flashing eyes. "It is war," returned the king savagely. "In 3 days, your friend will be dead." The master turned away and came to his Forest of Burzee, where he called a meeting of the immortals and told them of the defiance of the Aguas and their purpose to kill Claus within 3 days. The little folk listened to him quietly. "What shall we do?" asked Ak. "These creatures are of no benefit to the world," said the Prince of the Nooks. "We must destroy them." "Their lives are devoted only to evil deeds," said the Prince of the Rills. "We must destroy them." They have no conscience, and the endeavor to make all immortals as bad as themselves, said the Queen of Fairies. We must destroy them. They have defied the great Ak and threatened the life of our adopted son, said beautiful Queen Zerline. We must destroy them. The Master Woodsman smiled. You speak well, said he. These Aguas we know to be a powerful race, and they will fight desperately. Yet the outcome is certain, for we who live can never die, even though conquered by our enemies, while every Agua who is struck down is one foe the less to oppose us. Prepare, then, for battle, and let us resolve to show no mercy to the wicked. Thus arose that terrible war between the immortals and the spirits of evil which is sung of in fairyland to this very day. The King Agua and his band determined to carry out the threat to destroy Claus. They now hated him for two reasons. He made children happy and was a friend of the Master Woodsman. But since Ak's visit, they had reason to fear the opposition of the immortals, and they dreaded defeat. So the king sent swift messengers to all parts of the world to summon every evil creature to his aid. And on the third day after the declaration of war, a mighty army was at the command of the King Agua. There were 300 Asiatic dragons breathing fire that consumed everything it touched. These hated mankind and all good spirits. And there were three-eyed giants of Tateri, a host in themselves who liked nothing better than to fight. And next came the black demons from Patagonia, with great spreading wings like those of a bat, which swept terror and misery throughout the world as they beat upon the air. And joined to these were the Goozle goblins, with long talons and sharp as swords, which meant they clawed the flesh from their foes. Finally, every mountain Agua in the world had come to participate in the great battle with the immortals. The King Agua looked around upon this vast army, and his heart beat high with wicked pride, for he believed the world surely triumph. For he believed he would surely triumph over his gentle enemies, who had never before been known to fight. But the Master Woodsman had not been idle. None of his people was used to warfare, yet now they were called upon to face the hosts of evil they willingly prepared for the fray. Ak had commanded them to assemble in the Laughing Valley, where Claus, ignorant of the terrible battle that was to be waged on his account, was quietly making his toys. Soon, the entire valley, from hill to hill, was filled with the little immortals. The Master Woodsman stood first, bearing a gleaming axe that shone like burnished silver. Next came the Rills, armed with sharp thorns from bramble bushes. Then the Nooks, bearing the spears they had used when they were forced to prod their savage beasts into submission. The Fairies, dressed in white gauze with rainbow-hued wings, bore golden wands, and the Wood Nymphs, in their uniforms of oak leaf green, carried switches from ash trees as weapons. Loud laughed the Agua King when he beheld the size and arms of his foes. To be sure, the mighty axe of the woodsman was to be dreaded, but the sweet-faced nymphs and pretty fairies, the gentle rills and crooked nooks, were such harmless folk that he almost felt shame at having called such a terrible host to oppose them. Since these fools dare fight, he said to the leader of the Taltry giants, I will overwhelm them with our evil powers. To begin the battle, he poised a great stone in his left hand and cast it full against the sturdy form of the Master Woodsman, who turned it aside with his axe. Then rushed the three-eyed giants of Tateri upon the Nooks, and the Goozle goblins upon the Rills, and the fire-breathing dragons upon the sweet fairies. Because the nymphs were Ak's own people, the brand of Aguas sought them out, seeking to overcome them with ease. But it is the law that while evil, unopposed, may accomplish terrible deeds, the powers of good can never be overthrown when opposed to evil. Well had it been for the King Agua he had known the law. His ignorance cost him his existence, for one flash of the axe borne by the Master Woodsman of the world cleft the wicked king in twain and rid the earth of the vilest creature it contained. Greatly marveled the Tatiri giants when the spears of the little nooks pierced their thick walls of flesh and sent them reeling to the ground with howls of agony. Woe came upon the sharp-taloned goblins when the thorns of the rills reached their savage hearts and let their life-blood sprinkle all the plain. And afterward from every drop a thistle grew. The dragons paused astonished before the fairy wands from whence rushed a power that caused their fiery breaths to flow back on themselves, so that they shriveled away and died. As for the Aguas, they had scant time to realize how they were destroyed, for the ash switches of the nymphs bore a charm unknown to any Agua and turned their foes into clods of earth at the slightest touch. When Ak leaned upon his gleaming axe and turned to look over the field of battle, he saw the few giants who were able to run disappearing over the distant hills in their return to Tatari. The goblins had perished every one, and had the terrible dragons, while all that remained of the wicked Aguas was a great number of earthen hillocks dotting the plain. And now the immortals melted from the valley like dew at sunrise, to resume their duties in the forest, while Ak walked slowly and thoughtfully to the house of Claus and entered. "You have many toys ready for the children," said the woodsman, "and now you may carry them across the plain to the dwellings of the villages without fear." "Will not the Aguas harm me?" asked Claus eagerly. "The Aguas," said Ak, "have perished. Now I will gladly have done with wicked spirits and fighting and bloodshed. It was not from choice that I told of the Aguas and their allies, and of their great battle with immortals. They were part of this history and could not be avoided." And we will stop there for today. Tomorrow we will pick up with the chapter 8, the first journey with the reindeer. So that's bound to be very, very interesting. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you've enjoyed this reading of the life and adventures of Santa Claus. Please tune in tomorrow as we pick up with chapter 8. Please have a great rest of your Monday today. Please remember to stay safe out there and wear a mask, please.